Pawn d2 to d4. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn c2 to c4. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn d4 to d5. Pawn e7 to e6. Knight b1 to c3. Pawn e6 takes d5. Pawn c4 takes d5. Pawn d7 to d6. Knight g1 to f3. Pawn g7 to g6. Pawn e2 to e4. Bishop f8 to g7. Bishop f1 to e2. Castle kingside. Castle kingside. Pawn h7 to h6. Pawn e4 to e5. Pawn d6 takes e5. Knight f3 takes e5. Knight f6 takes d5. Queen d1 takes d5. Queen d8 takes d5. Knight c3 takes d5. Bishop g7 takes e5. Bishop c1 takes h6. Rook f8 to e8. Rook a1 to e1. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop e2 to b5. Bishop c8 to f5. Pawn g2 to g4. Bishop f5 to c2. Knight d5 to e3. King g8 to h7. Bishop h6 to g5. Pawn f7 to f6. Bishop b5 takes c6. Pawn b7 takes c6. Knight e3 takes c2. Pawn f6 takes g5. Pawn b2 to b3. Rook a8 to d8. Rook e1 to e3. Rook d8 to d2. Rook f1 to e1. Rook d2 takes c2. Rook e3 takes e5. Rook e8 takes e5. Rook e1 takes e5. King h7 to h6. King g1 to g2. Pawn a7 to a5. Pawn h2 to h3. Rook c2 takes a2. Rook e5 takes c5. Rook a2 to a3. Rook c5 takes c6. Rook a3 takes b3. Rook c6 to a6. Rook b3 to a3. Rook a6 to a7. Rook a3 to a2. King g2 to f3. Rook a2 to a3, check. King f3 to g2. Pawn a5 to a4. King g2 to h2. Rook a3 to a2. King h2 to g3. Rook a2 to a3, check. King g3 to g2. Rook a3 to a1. King g2 to f3. Rook a1 to a3, check. King f3 to g2. Rook a3 to a2. King g2 to f1. Rook a2 to a3. King f1 to e2. Rook a3 to a2, check. King e2 to e3. Rook a2 to a3, check. King e3 to e4. Rook a3 to a2. Pawn f2 to f4. Rook a2 to e2, check. King e4 to f3. Rook e2 to a2. Rook a7 to a6. Rook a2 to a3, check. King f3 to e4. Pawn g5 takes f4. Pawn h3 to h4. Pawn f4 to f3. Pawn h4 to h5. Pawn f3 to f2. Rook a6 takes g6, check. King h6 to h7. Rook g6 to f6. Rook a3 to g3. Rook f6 takes f2. Rook g3 takes g4, check. King e4 to f5. Rook g4 to b4. King f5 to g5. Rook b4 to b5, check. King g5 to g4. Rook b5 to a5. Rook f2 to f7, check. King h7 to g8. Rook f7 to b7. Pawn a4 to a3. Rook b7 to b8, check. King g8 to g7. Rook b8 to b7, check. King g7 to f8. Rook b7 to b8, check. King f8 to g7. Rook b8 to b7, check. King g7 to f6. Rook b7 to b6, check. King f6 to f7. Rook b6 to b7, check. King f7 to f6. Rook b7 to b6, check. King f6 to e7. Rook b6 to b7, check. King e7 to d6. Rook b7 to b1. Pawn a3 to a2. Rook b1 to a1. King d6 to e5. King g4 to f3. Rook a5 to a3, check. King f3 to e2. Rook a3 to h3. King e2 to d2. Rook h3 takes h5. King d2 to c2. King e5 to d4. Rook a1 takes a2. Rook h5 to h2, check. King c2 to b1. Rook h2 takes a2. King b1 takes a2. King d4 to c4. King a2 to b2. King c4 to d3. King b2 to b3. King d3 to e3. King b3 to c4. King e3 to e4. King c4 to c3. King e4 to d5. King c3 to d3. King d5 to e5. King d3 to c3. King e5 to e4. King c3 to c4. King e4 to e5. King c4 to c3. King e5 to e4. King c3 to c4. King e4 to e5. King c4 to c3. The game is a draw.